From the days of Egypt and Mesopotamia right up till the present day, strong dominant societies have always tried to pretty much reign over the weaker ones by subjecting them to what we call imperial rule. But during the second half of the 19th century, a handful of Western European states um, wrote probably the most important chapter in imperialism. So there were strong nationalistic sentiments that we talked about, the rise of nationalism around this time in the late Enlightenment period. And this enabled them to mobilize populations for purposes of overseas expansion. So, because the Industrial Revolution had already happened at this point, they had the equipment and the technology and the effective tools and most of the lethal weapons available anywhere in the world. So Western Europe was on top of the world at this point, post-industrial revolution, halfway through the 1800s, especially Britain, of course. So 3 centuries of experience with marine trade in Asia, Africa, and the Americas and Oceania provided them with the knowledge of the world and its peoples. Remember, the British already had a major empire at this point. Um, yeah, so they conquered foreign armies with ease, the European peoples. They dominated foreign economies and they imposed their hegemony throughout the world. So, towards the end of the 1800s, the 19th century, um, United States and Japan also joined as the imperial powers. So, in this tutorial, what we're going to be looking at is topic 28. Constructing global empires. Imperialism. And this occurred, as I said, in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s. And the take home message for this is that it saw much of the world brought under the control of the Western powers. So, imperialism it tightened links between the world societies. It encouraged trade between dominant states and their overseas colonies. So it encouraged trade between, for example, Great Britain and New Zealand and Australia and India. These 3 countries, post-imperialist countries, still part of the Commonwealth, of course. And There were mass migrations of labourers to work in agricultural and industrial ventures. Imperialism also fostered, though, divisions between the world's people. Powerful tools, deadly weapons, and tempted European people to consider themselves superior to their subjects throughout the world. Modern racism is one of the legacies of imperialism, I guess. So, European superiority, racial superiority. Another effect was the development of resistance and nationalism in subject lands. So resistance in Africa and India. And I guess the resistance would eventually lead to the global empires, the formal empires dissolving in the 20th century. But the legacy of imperialism has definitely shaped our world. I mean, we wouldn't be here in New Zealand. White people aren't from this part of the world, are they? If it wasn't for imperialism, if it wasn't for British imperialism. Okay, so as we said, imperialism has existed since the dawn of time, really. It's an old story in world history. But by the 19th century, European observers recognized that empires of their day were different from those of earlier times because they had industry, communication, transport. They could construct global empires. So, in contemporary usage, in today's usage, imperialism refers to the domination over subject lands in the larger world. Okay, so domination over subject lands. Sometimes the domination came through formal imperialism, which involved military conquest and the establishment of political control. Okay, so there's formal imperialism. But frequently, especially in the British Empire, it was informal imperialism. Which involved domination of trade, investment, business activities that enabled imperial powers to profit from subject societies and influence their affairs without going to the trouble of exercising direct political control. So it was more focused on trade, economics, whereas formal was military and political control. So the establishment of colonies in the foreign lands was not just the settlement of people from the host countries. I mean, from the countries of, the imperialist countries to the host countries, but it was also the political, social, and economic and cultural structures that enabled imperial powers to dominate the subject lands. So, when we think of, say, white colonial countries, we think of New Zealand, of course. We think of South Africa. We think of Chile, North America, Argentina, Australia. Countries that today have significantly larger white populations. I mean, all those countries that I said have white majorities, apart from South Africa. So these countries were largely populated by migrants from the home societies. Okay, yet we also think of European, like back in the 1800s, there was also significant European colonies in other imperially ruled countries, like India had significant white population. Mainly, it was mainly people that worked there though, that worked for the British Crown, directly overseeing what was going on there. They didn't really have like people move there and form their own societies from Britain. Yeah, so there was white people in Southeast Asia, French Indochina, notably, and Sub-Saharan Africa, not just South Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, there are significant white populations in Tanzania, Zimbabwe, or back when it was called Rhodesia, Swaziland, Somalia. I mean, they're all gone now, but yes. So even though the Europeans did not settle in these latter countries in large numbers, um, European agents eventually effectively turned these places into colonies by controlling their domestic and foreign policies, integrating local economies into the network of global capitalism, and promoting European educational and cultural preferences. Like Sub-Saharan Africa is mainly Christian due to the cultural takeover of this part of the world by Europeans. And yet North Africa is Muslim, of course, because it was never really colonized like Sub-Saharan Africa was. So what were the motives of imperialism? Okay, so I guess the first and perhaps the most important one were the economic motives. The economic motives of imperialism. So during the second half of the 19th century, it was believed that imperial expansion and colonial domination were crucial for the survival of societies, of European societies. Some advocates argued that imperialism was in the economic interests of European societies as well as individuals. They pointed out overseas colonies could serve as a reliable source of raw materials, rubber, tin, copper, petroleum, of course, also as well. So there was definite economic motives. I guess the second one would be political motives. So even if the colonies weren't economically beneficial, they thought it was crucial for political and military reasons to maintain them. For strategic reasons, such as having control over sea lanes and harbours, supply stations for commercial and naval ships, or simply just to have the states so other rivals wouldn't take them. Like we're going to talk about soon, the scramble for Africa. That's probably an example of that. It promoted nationalism and patriotism by focusing public attention on, these imperialist ventures that the countries were doing. Missionaries flocked to Africa and Asian lands in search of converts to Christianity. There was thus a religious justification for it. I guess the last one would be cultural reasons. Cultural motives for imperialism. So I guess the main cultural one was civilizing these third world countries that they were going to, and either colonizing or overseeing political structures. So bringing civilization and a form of political order. So even with all the willpower in the world, the European peoples would not have been able to colonize the world um, and rule over as much of the world as they did without the fruits of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution provided the adequate technologies that facilitated imperialism on such the scale that it had. So I guess the most important innovation in transportation involved steamships and railroads. So during the 1830s, British naval engineers adapted steam power to military uses and built large ironclad ships that were equipped with very powerful guns. They travelled much faster than any sailing vessel, and they could ignore winds and travel in any direction. And once they gained control of overseas lands through imperialist takeover, the railroads helped them maintain their own economies and their own advantage. So it was this acceleration of movement facilitated by the Industrial Revolution that really helped imperialism and allowed the armies and colonial officials to travel quickly throughout the colonies. It also helped facilitate trade, of course, and the distribution of European manufactured goods to the colonies. There are, of course, military and communication technologies that were very important as well. The military technologies were, of course, powerful weapons. By the middle of the 1800s, European armies were using breech-loading firearms with rifled bores that were far more accurate and reliable than any other firearm. And by the 1870s, the Europeans were also experimenting with machine guns. steamships, of course, and the railroads facilitated communication technologies. But by the 1850s, correspondents could make a round trip between London and Bombay, which of course is in India, in about 4 months. And with the opening of the Suez Canal, in 1869, steamships travel from Britain to India in less than 2 weeks. Now, the Suez Canal allows water travel from Europe through Africa to the Indian Ocean. There is the Suez Canal there, as you can see, having this opened up in the late 1800s made it much easier for the steamships to travel to India and around the world. Beneficial for military needs, armies, trade, and communication. Okay, so imperial expansion began then with the British conquest of India. And competition between imperial powers led to European intrusion into Central Asia and the establishment of colonies in Southeast Asia, and even interference in the Ottoman and Qing empires of Southwest East Asia. The European states embarked on a campaign of frenzied expansion in the 1880s that brought almost all of Africa and the Pacific territories into their empires. Okay, so the British conquest of India. So the British Empire in South Asia grew out of mercantile activities of the English East India Company. Which enjoyed a monopoly on English trade with India. In the 17th century, so the 1600s, company merchants traded mostly for Indian pepper and cotton, Chinese silk and porcelain, and spices. During the 18th century, tea and coffee became more prominent. And in the 1750s, company merchants began campaigns of outright conquest in India. Largely to protect their commercial interests. So in 1857, following widespread campaigns of conquest that left most of the subcontinent under British control, Indian sepoys of the Bengal army revolted, so there was a revolt. It was quickly supported by civilian peasants and disgruntled elites who were deeply dissatisfied with the British colonies regarding taxation and law, and to regain control, the British waged a bloody campaign of retribution in which many thousands of Indians, including civilians, lost their lives. and summary hangings, destruction of villages. And once order was restored in 1858, the British government abolished the East India Company and assumed direct rule over the subcontinent. Okay, so no more East India Company, but now direct British imperial rule. So under the new administration, Queen Victoria, who was reigning in this period, assigned responsibility for Indian policy to the new established office of the Secretary of State for India. So there was an elite Indian civil service that was staffed almost exclusively by the English, and Indians served in low-level bureaucratic positions, but British officials formulated all domestic and foreign policy in India. So British rule transformed India. So British officials cleared forest, encouraged cultivation of crops to profit from India's enormous size and wealth, restructured land holdings, ensured that there were taxes. They did some good things, though. They actually didn't do anything to promote Christianity. So that's why the vast majority of the Indian subcontinent today is either Hindu or Muslim. When you compare this to sub-Saharan Africa, which is mainly Christian, it's quite interesting. So they let them retain their religion, but they did suppress cultural things that were contradictory to civilized society. Like they stopped widows from throwing themselves onto the burning remains of their husbands, which was very common in India. The widows would throw themselves onto the fire where their husbands' remains were getting burned. They stopped that. They stopped infanticide as well. And they built English-style schools for the Indian elites. So here we have the Indian subcontinent, and the green shows that it was under the rule of Great Britain. So we also got imperialism in the rest of South Asia. We have down here the Dutch East Indies, one of the Netherlands' only colonies. People from the Netherlands are called Dutch, just if you didn't know. As the East India Company and British colonial agents tightened their grip on India, there was competition among the European states, due to Britain's successful empire building efforts. So Dutch officials, they tightened their control and extended their authority throughout the Dutch East Indies, down here in blue. And this makes up modern day Indonesia. And they had their cash crops there of sugar and tea and coffee and tobacco and rubber and tin, and therefore it was a valuable colony. British imperialists also moved in the 19th century to establish a presence in other countries other than India and Southeast Asia. By the 1880s, they had established colonial authority in Burma, south of Nepal, which became a source of ivories and teak and rubies and jade. In 1824, the port of Singapore down here was founded, which soon became the busiest centre of trade in the area. Singapore served as the base for British conquest of Malaysia in the 1870s and the 1880s. And it linked the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea. So it was important strategically, economically, and politically. And I guess another important one in the area was French Indochina, shown here in purple, which now makes up Vietnam, Cambodia, and I think parts of Laos, if I remember correctly. But yeah, French imperialists, they built the large Southeast Asian colony of French Indochina between 1859 and 1893, so almost getting into the 20th century there. French colonial officials, they introduced European-style schools and sought to establish close connections with the native elites. They encouraged conversion to Christianity. But yeah, by the century's end, by the end of the 1800s, I guess, this whole region, Southeast Asia, had come under European imperial rule, except for the Kingdom of Siam, which is modern-day Thailand. And of course, China wasn't, but China's not Southeast Asia, China's East Asia. So Siam, which is now modern-day Thailand, was the only one that wasn't under imperial rule. So the European powers embarked on a pretty striking outburst of formal imperialism in Africa. Now, prior to the 19th century, European colonization of Africa was not successful. They were pretty much, apart from in South Africa, they were pretty much restricted to ports on the coastline. But the technologies of the Industrial Revolution, such as guns, machine guns, also anti-malaria and anti-malaria drugs and tonics, made it possible for the proper, and steamships, of course, and the mobilization of big armies made it possible finally for the colonization of Africa, something that just simply could not have occurred beforehand. So, since as late as 1875, European peoples maintained a limited presence in Africa. Their only sizable possessions were the Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique, and the French settler colony in northern Algeria, which is up here, and a cluster of settler colonies populated by British and Dutch migrants in South Africa, as I said, the South African colonization that had been the white South Africans that had been there since about the 1600s. So between 1875 and 1900, the relationship between Africa and Europe dramatically changed. Within a quarter of the century, European imperial powers partitioned and colonized almost the entire African continent, with the idea of economically exploiting its resources, and nationalist rivalries between European powers helped explain the frenzied quest for capture, often referred to as the Scramble for Africa. In the 1870s, King Leopold II of Belgium, he developed commercial ventures and established a colony called the Congo Free State. In the middle of sub-Saharan Africa, landlocked, which is the modern-day Democratic Republic of the Congo. And to forestall competition from Belgium's much larger, more powerful European neighbours such as France and England, Leopold announced that the Congo region would be a free trade zone, accessible to merchants and business people from all European lands. However, he carved out a personal colony with the sole purpose of extracting lucrative rubber using forced labour. Rubber. He used forced labour to do this. So working conditions were brutal, taxes were high. Something like 4 to 8 million Africans died. Once the abuses became public, humanitarian pressure induced Belgian government to take over in 1908. Belgian government takes over and administered the colony themselves. So, as Leopold colonized Central Africa, Britain established an imperial position in Egypt. In an effort to build up their army, strengthen their economy, and distance themselves from the Ottoman authority. Egypt's leaders had borrowed heavily from European leaders, and by the 1870s, the British forces, who were concerned over the status of the Suez Canal, pretty much took over and occupied Egypt in 1882. And here, this shows Egypt controlled by the British in blue. There we've got the Nile, and Cairo there. And we have the Belgian Congo, which was controlled by Leopold and taken over by the Belgian government in 1908 because he was killing too many Africans. So the British occupation of Egypt intensified tensions between the European powers who were seeking African colonies. And to avoid war, delegates delegates, between European states and the United States met at the Berlin West Africa Conference of 1884 to 1885 to devise ground rules for the colonization of Africa. Okay? So according to the rules, any European state could establish African colonies after notifying the others of its intentions and occupying previously unclaimed territory. So during the late 1890s, European imperialists sent armies to impose colonial rule on the African territories they claimed. Although resistance was quite fierce often, the European cannons and machine guns, as we said, the post-industrial technology, always took over the African forces. So by the turn of the 20th century, European colonies embraced all of Africa except Ethiopia. Whose native forces fought off the Italian efforts. And Liberia as well, a small West African republic. It was effectively a dependency of the USA though. So Liberia and Ethiopia weren't colonized. So in the wake of this rapid conquest, the Europeans struggled to identify the most cost-effective and efficient system of rule in Africa. So by the early 20th century, after some experimentation, most European governments sought to establish their own rule, which took the form of either direct rule or indirect rule. The British had an indirect rule. Under direct rule, colonies were headed by European personnel. And in indirect rule, control was exercised over subject populations through indigenous institutions, such as tribal authorities and customary laws. So both of these methods were flawed. Under direct rule, imperial powers struggled with a constant shortage of European personnel. As we know, Africa wasn't, fully colonized by the whites. And indirect rule imposed European ideas about tribal categories, and the cross-cultural shit didn't work pretty much. So in the Pacific, settlers began to arrive in Australia in 1788. Nearly 2 decades after Captain James Cook reported that the region would be suitable for settlement. So in that year, a British fleet with about 1,000 settlers, most of them convicted criminals, arrived at Sydney Harbour and established the colony of New South Wales. By the 1830s, voluntary migrants. Outnumbered the convicts, and the discovery of gold in 1851 brought a surge in migration to Australia. European settlers also established communities in New Zealand. Heard of that country? Where the island's fertile soils and abundant timber forests grew large numbers of migrants. So European migration rocked the societies that were already established in Australia and New Zealand. Diseases such as smallpox and measles devastated the indigenous populations once the Europeans flooded into the lands. The Aboriginal population of Australia fell from about 650,000 in 1800 to about 90,000 in 1900, whereas the European population rose from a few thousand to 3.75 million during the same period. The Maori had a similar fate, fell from about 200,000 in 1800 to about 45,000 a century later, while the European numbers climbed to 750,000 by 1900. So increasing migration also fueled conflict between European settlers and native populations. Large settler societies pushed indigenous people from their lands, often following violent confrontations. And because of the nomadic foraging people of Australia did not occupy land permanently, the British settlers considered the land belonging to no one, and so they could seize it and put it to their own uses. So by 1900, despite resistance, the British had succeeded in brutally displacing most indigenous Australians and dispersing them through the continent. So with these new colonies followed the age of mass European migration. So from 1800 to 1914, 50 million Europeans left their homes to find opportunity in other continents. Including our ancestors. So in the 19th century Europe, rising birth rates and falling mortality rates led to a population boom. This led to an abundance of available workers, which forced down wages for peasants and labourers. So because of this, the migrants tended to be unskilled, young, single males who had little to lose and everything to gain by leaving their homes. In addition, many Jews, as we said before, fled Europe to escape persecution. In this period, 2 million European Jews, fled to the Americas. From Russia, escaping pogroms, the lynchings and that in Russia, and it's kind of like a good thing, a blessing in disguise, really, because it was those that escaped the Holocaust. Also, the Great Famine in Ireland from 1845 to 1852 led to over a million people leaving Ireland and going to either Australia, New Zealand, Canada, or America, mainly America. Their destinations, all these people that left, all these Europeans, their destinations offered ample job opportunities as well as higher wages and standards of living. In need of labour, countries practiced open border policies to encourage immigration. However, after World War II, the migration policies became more strict. Individuals who had settled in the new countries often helped friends and family from Europe join them by sending money home to purchase tickets. In addition, advances in transport brought down the cost of immigration, making leaving home even more attractive. So, from 1815 to 1930, the British Isles and Italy were the most consistent exporters of high numbers of people over the period. But Portugal, Spain, Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary were also important. Although in absolute terms, northern European nations like Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, and Finland supplied little migrants, fewer, the percentage of their population that immigrated was similar to the United Kingdom's, and occasionally even exceeded it. So pretty much every European country had massive migration during this period. So the majority, as I said, went to the USA. The four next popular destinations were Canada, Argentina, Brazil, and Australia. About 600,000 went to New Zealand. The mass migration transformed society. For example, Uruguay and Australia have over 90% of the population descendants from European migrants. New Zealand has about 70% descended from Europeans. In comparison to the free European migrants from Africa, Asia, and Oceania, they tended to move as indentured labourers. The majority came from India, but there were also numbers from China and Japan. And as a result of the abolition of slavery, there was huge demand for labour in plantations and mines and construction. Employers paid for the passage of indentured labourers, along with giving them food, shelter, and clothing, and a small wage. In return, they had to work, often for like 5 to 7 years, to pay it off. So in this section, we've looked at the imperialism that took over the world in the late 1800s, particularly in Asia, South Asia, and Africa, the scramble for Africa. We also looked at the demographic changes and the great export of Europeans from Europe to the colonies, to the Americas and Australia and New Zealand and Africa that occurred in the 1800s.